Just under a week after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, Trump finally hit Twitter with a few tweets addressing the disaster. Texas and Florida are doing great, but Puerto Rico, which was already suffering from broken infrastructure and massive debt, is in deep trouble. Its old electrical grid, which was in terrible shape, was devastated. Much of the island was destroyed, with billions of dollars owed to Wall Street and the banks, which sadly must be dealt with. Food, water, and medical are top priorities, and doing well. So Trump clearly had no real plan for Puerto Rico even before this disaster was an issue. So he mentions three main points in those tweets: a broken infrastructure, an old electrical grid, and billions of dollars owed to Wall Street. So well before a hurricane was ever an issue, there was a 2016 candidate that actually addressed all these points. And that candidate was Rick Santorum. I'm joking, it was Bernie Sanders. So Bernie was the only 2016 candidate to actually go to the island himself. And he has a history of fighting for the Puerto Rican people and had a substantial plan for it in his platform. So I want to go over a few of those points, and first, let's hit on one of the points that Trump mentioned in his tweets, which was infrastructure. So in a detailed plan that's laid out for Puerto Rico on BernieSanders.com, it says this: Bernie's Rebuild America Act would create more than 150,000 good-paying jobs in Puerto Rico and put 13 million people to work all over the U.S. This plan would help build Puerto Rico's crumbling roads and bridges, improve its ports, upgrade its drinking water and wastewater plants, and fortify flood control projects. There, Bernie mentions a few points that Puerto Rico is now currently dealing with to the extreme. So, bridges, drinking water, and floods. And in this clip from 2015, Bernie addresses Puerto Rico's infrastructure.
But I want to say a word now on the energy situation. I have not heard one word, or maybe I missed it, on a phrase called sustainable energy. As I understand it, Puerto Rico today is producing its electricity 55% from oil, 28% from natural gas, 16% from coal, 1% from renewables. Now, unless Puerto Rico's advertising is incorrect, last I heard you were a sunny island. You were an island. There's wind. I do not understand why you are producing electricity from oil and why we are not investing significantly into sustainable energy. I know there are plans underway, but you have huge potential to lead this part of the world.
Which goes into the next point that Trump addressed in his tweets, which is the old electrical grid. And Bernie had a plan for that on his website as well. Bernie's Rebuild America Act will help modernize the island's antiquated electrical grid to end rolling blackouts and make it easier to integrate new solar and wind installations. Updating Puerto Rico's energy system is also critically important in terms of addressing the island's debt crisis, since the single largest debt, more than $9 billion, is owed by the Puerto Rico Electrical Power Authority. So right now, one of the main issues that Puerto Ricans are dealing with is the power grid. So it's expected that Puerto Rico might not have power for the next 6 months, and one of the main reasons for this is explained by a former EPA minister. Judith Enck identifies dual culprits: power plants that required fossil fuels and rickety old transmissions. Puerto Rico's existing energy infrastructure relied primarily on oil or coal, and despite unreliable and unsustainable power sources, she adds, residents were paying some of the highest utility rates in the country. Okay, so obviously if Bernie Sanders had actually become president, there wouldn't have been enough time for Puerto Rico to completely transfer its power grid to sustainable energy. But you can see that Bernie Sanders is on the right track. And if Puerto Rico had actually been self-sustaining and relied on wind and solar energy, they would have had an easier time dealing with this crisis because something like solar power allows you access to electricity without directly being on the grid. Now, the last point that Trump mentioned in his tweets was the billions owed to Wall Street. Now, Bernie Sanders sees it a little differently.
Puerto Rico now has more income inequality than any state in the United States. In the midst of this massive human crisis, it is morally unacceptable that billionaire hedge fund managers have been calling for even more austerity in Puerto Rico. Austerity will not solve this crisis.
And in addition to being against austerity, Bernie's plan also included fighting to give Puerto Rico the same Chapter 9 bankruptcy protections that exist for municipalities in the United States. saying Puerto Rico should be able to restructure its debt in a rational and organized way that protects its people without harming ordinary investors and pension funds in the United States. And Bernie also had a plan to audit Puerto Rico's debt to investigate whether it was incurred legally. If any debt was issued to creditors in violation of Puerto Rico's constitution, it must immediately be set aside. And on top of all of this, he was also against PROMESA, which was Puerto Rico's debt restructuring legislation that was being pushed by Congress last year, and that Bernie Sanders came out firmly against. Why? Well, one of the most controversial provisions of the bill is the reduction of the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $4.25 an hour for workers 25 years and younger, which sounds insane, and you can't imagine any Democrat would have voted for it, but they did, because it passed. And there was another candidate in the race who supported this, Hillary Clinton, who stated, "While I have serious concerns about several provisions in the bill, including the creation of an oversight board that would exert substantial control over Puerto Rico, I believe that we must move forward with this legislation." So while Bernie Sanders clearly had a lot of good plans for Puerto Rico, I'm not trying to pretend that all of this stuff would have been implemented in the first year if he became president. Clearly that isn't true, but this would have been a step in the right direction. And it's a place that ultimately Puerto Rico should aim to get to. And I also should mention that Bernie also supports a referendum for Puerto Rico to either become a state or an independent nation.
I believe that there should be a binding referendum. And if I'm elected president, that referendum will take place the first year of my administration for people to determine, not for me to determine, for you to determine. Some people I know want statehood. Some people want independence. Some people want something else. But that is a decision to be made by the people of Puerto Rico.
A choice that Puerto Ricans have wanted for a while.